1941. Germany had secured most of Central and Western Europe, with only Great Britain remaining defiant on the islands. The only potential threat to Germany in Europe was its former ally, the Soviet Union. In order to break the stalemate with Britain and make Germany's strategic position indisputable, Hitler decided to cripple the military capabilities of the Soviet Union and seize its natural resources. Germany planned to achieve this goal by capturing most of the European part of the Soviet Union before the onset of winter 1941. The main attack would take place in the center and be directed towards Moscow, with auxiliary attacks in the north and south. By the middle of June 1941, the Germans had almost completed the preparations and the invasion was about to begin. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces were unaware of what was coming and were ill-prepared to resist the German invasion. First, we'll look at the southern sector. The Soviets had deployed their strongest units in the south, having 1,200,000 men between the Pripyat marches and the Black Sea. They were to be confronted by the Army Group South that was of roughly the same strength. The first objective of the Axis troops was securing the western Ukraine. On June 22nd, the invasion began. The Soviets immediately gathered their armed forces and met the German spearhead with a massive counterattack in the area of Dubno and Brody. But due to the lack of combat readiness of the units involved, it failed, and the Soviets lost most of their tanks. The German advance continued, and this created a threat of encirclement to the Soviet troops in the south, and they had to be withdrawn from the exposed position. After the main attack had tied down the Soviet reserves, the Axis forces in Romania joined the offensive. The main spearhead now made a dash towards the east, and this made Soviet command think that the main German effort was directed towards Kiev. However, the Germans had stuck to their original plan and turned south. When the Soviets realized the German intentions, it was already too late to withdraw their forces, and the Germans encircled and destroyed many of the Soviet formations near the town of Uman. The Soviets now abandoned western Ukraine and retreated to the eastern bank of the river Dnieper. They deployed the first wave of freshly mobilized troops to establish a strong defense on the river line and also cling to the port of Odessa. At the same time, operations were being carried out in the north, where 1.5 million German soldiers from army groups north and center were facing 1 million Soviet soldiers. In the beginning of the invasion, the army group center was to encircle Soviet forces at the border and then advance towards Smolensk and Moscow. Meanwhile, army group north was to advance directly towards Leningrad, threatening to trap the Soviet forces between them and the sea. On June 22nd, the Germans attacked. The Soviet Western Front was deployed forward, and during the first days of the war, the German forces encircled most of its formations near the towns of Bialystok and Minsk. In the Baltics, the Soviet counterattacks were defeated in the Battle of Raseiniai, and then they attempted to pull back and establish a defensive line on Daugava River. But the Germans reached the river before them and pushed onwards, threatening the Soviet units in the west with encirclement. At the same time, Army Group Center had finished encircling the Soviet Western Front, and its infantry units began to reduce the pockets, while its armored forces advanced eastwards almost unopposed. The Soviets attempted to plug the gap by deploying most of their pre-war reserves to counter them, but it was not enough, and as the German offensive continued, their armor broke through the Soviet lines and trapped these units near Smolensk. By that time, the first wave of Soviet mobilization was complete, and the Soviets used these formations to block further German advance and attempted to free the encircled troops. However, the performance of these newly created units was lackluster, and they were unable to liberate the pocket. The Germans managed to close it up and eliminate it. The Germans had gained the upper hand in the central part of the front, and now they were faced with two options. They could continue the push towards Moscow immediately, or secure the flanks of Army Group Center first and then continue the offensive eastwards. They decided to do the latter, and the armored formations of Army Group Center were sent to aid neighboring army groups. During this time, battles had been raging in the north, where Army Group North had failed to pull out large encirclements, and their progress was slowed down by the Soviet counterattacks and bad infrastructure. Nevertheless, they were making slow but steady progress, and after securing their left flank, they reached the approaches to Leningrad. When the help from Army Group Center arrived, they were able to perform the final push and cut off the land-based communications to the city. Further north, Finland had entered the war against the Soviet Union on June 25th, and the Finnish troops took advantage of the Soviet defeats by taking back the lands lost in the Winter War. After that, they established forward defensive positions between the lakes. Even further north, the Finnish and German troops attempted to capture the Soviet port city of Murmansk and cut the Murmansk railway in order to sever the Allied supply route to the Soviet Union. However, their attacks became bogged down in the rough terrain short of their objectives. The front became static. Meanwhile, the other armored units of the Army Group Center were sent to help Army Group South. The Soviets had anticipated that the Germans would continue their attack towards Moscow and concentrated their troops on this direction, which allowed the German armored formations to push back the weaker Soviet units on their southern flank. The German advance southwards forced the Soviets to abandon their forward positions in the Pripyat marshes to shorten their line. In Ukraine, the Soviet troops were occupying a strong defensive position with their flanks resting on the Dnieper River in the west and south and the marshes in the north. Yet the panzers from Army Group Center were bypassing the marshes from the east and advanced into the Soviet rear. The Soviets thought that the German spearhead was overextended and could be contained. However, unbeknownst to them, the armored formations of the Army Group South had secretly crossed the Dnieper from the south into a German breachhead and now broke through towards north to link up with the spearhead. As the groups met, most of the Soviet units in the central Ukraine became encircled. 750,000 men were trapped in the pocket. When the pocket had been liquidated, the Soviet forces in Ukraine had been severely weakened. After these operations, the flanks of Army Group Center were secure, but now the Germans didn't have enough time to reach the objectives set in the beginning of the campaign, and they decided to go for more limited goals. In order to reach them, they began a full-scale attack along the whole front. In the south, the Soviet resistance had been crippled with the recent encirclement, and this allowed the Germans to carry out another encirclement, trapping part of the Soviet forces on the coast of the Black Sea. Then they pushed onwards and established their control over the resource-rich areas of the eastern Ukraine and conquered the Crimean Peninsula, with Soviets abandoning Odessa but clinging on to the port of Sevastopol. At the same time, the German forces were pursuing their objectives in the north. Their goal was to sever the remaining supply route to Leningrad and link up with the Finnish forces. The initial advance was successful and reached its first goal by cutting the railway line supplying the city. The main German effort was in the center. All this time the Soviets had anticipated an attack on Moscow and had deployed 1,250,000 mobilized troops to the sector. During the German operations on the flanks, they had even somewhat managed to push Army Group Center back to improve their defensive perimeter, but by the end of September, the German armor had finally returned to the center and proceeded to carry out a new attack. Once again, near the towns of Vyazma and Bryansk, the Soviet troops were encircled, and this resulted in halving the Soviet strength on the front. After reducing the pockets, the Germans closed their distance to Moscow. Then they attempted to encircle Moscow with a two-pronged attack, but by that time the long advance had exhausted their offensive capabilities and the weather had become severely cold. The Soviets managed to halt their advance, and although they didn't have large superiority in numbers, the Soviet proficiency in winter combat allowed them to carry out a counterattack. The Germans were forced to abandon their vulnerable forward positions on the flanks and pulled back in order to shorten the front line. During the retreat, they had to abandon some of their heavy equipment. At the same time, the German attempt to cut off Leningrad had also failed, and they had to retreat to their starting positions, and the supply line to Leningrad was restored. In the south, the German advance was also checked by the Soviets, forcing the Germans to abandon their forward positions in Rostov. The first year of the war was over. The Soviets had stopped the Germans far from their initial goals, but at the great cost to their own military capabilities. The Red Army had been decimated, and it would take a year or more to fully rebuild and re-equip the army. The Germans wanted to use this window of opportunity and were sending most of their available forces to the Eastern Front to deliver a knockout punch in the following year. 1942 would be the decisive year of the war. In 1941, the Axis invaded the Soviet Union, planning to overrun the European part of it before the onset of winter. However, the resistance was stronger than expected, and by the beginning of October they had expended much of their offensive capabilities. Assuming that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, they launched an all-out attack. The Soviet Union had still resources left, and the Axis forces found themselves overextended. The Red Army was seriously weakened, but it did not let the opportunity slip and counterattacked with all available forces, forcing the Axis into a retreat. In the Black Sea region, the Soviets undertook an amphibious operation. They landed their forces in the Crimea, survived the Axis counterattack, and made preparations to take the whole peninsula. In Ukraine, they pushed towards the Dnieper River and managed to gain ground before their attack was contained. Near Leningrad, the Red Army broke a breach into the German line and pushed into their rear, threatening to unhinge their front. The Soviets concentrated most of their forces against the army group center. After having pulled back from the approaches of Moscow, the Germans decided to stand fast and regroup on their present positions. This gave the Red Army a chance to conduct an encirclement of the German forces. Overextension had created several gaps in the German lines, and Red Army exploited them in order to bypass and cut off the German units. Despite of moving behind the German lines, they did not have enough strength to cut the main railway supplying the German forces, and the Germans were able to cut off and contain the breakthroughs. In the north, the Soviets encircled the German Second Corps at Demyansk, but it was sustained by air supply. After realizing that it lacked the strength to conduct a major attack, the Red Army concentrated its efforts on the most promising sectors. However, by this time the Germans had secured their position, and the attacks achieved only minimal progress. After having reorganized further, the Germans were able to conduct small offensives of their own in the most critical sectors. They destroyed some Soviet units in the army group center's rear and re-established a land connection with the Demyansk pocket. As the winter ended, both sides drew up their plans for the summer. The Soviets were rebuilding the Red Army, but it would be far from ready by summer, and the Axis would still have the upper hand. The Soviets believed the Axis would use this to undertake a major offensive towards Moscow and prepared to take a defensive stance. The question was what to do with the many salients that had been formed in the front. They provided good opportunities for the encirclement of both the Axis and Soviet units and were difficult to defend. In order to conduct a successful defense, they would have to be eliminated. One option was to abandon the salients, the other was to destroy the Axis-held salients. Although it was not clear if the Red Army would have enough strength to do so, they decided to risk it. They would destroy the Axis forces in vulnerable positions, and this would drain the strength from the main Axis attack. After the main attack was repelled, the build-up of the Red Army would have reached a level that would allow it to go on a major offensive. The Germans were indeed preparing to carry out a major attack. Comparing with the previous year, their resources had decreased and they were unable to mount a large Barbarossa-style offensive. Instead, they planned to undertake several consecutive offensives in order to destroy the Soviet Union. As the first step, they would capture the Caucasus oil fields in order to deny the Soviet Union most of their oil supply and gain a long-term source of it themselves. This would allow the Germans to continue waging the war in full capacity. Next, Leningrad would be taken, and then the Murmansk Railroad would be cut, depriving the Soviet Union of its main sources of foreign aid. Meanwhile, in the center, the German forces would hold their forward positions in order to provide a good springboard for an offensive. After the Red Army had been weakened by previous steps and the Axis had freed up their forces, they would occupy the main Soviet industrial base in central Russia. Before and during the main operations, the Axis would clear out as many of the contested areas as possible to free up more troops. The first Soviet attack was in the north, where they attempted to push the Axis forces back in order to increase the security of the Murmansk Railroad, but they failed to make any serious advances in the rough terrain and went on a defensive. The next operation was meant to destroy the most vulnerable German salient at Demyansk, but the Germans continued to hold on to their positions and their progress was minimal. The next operation was undertaken by the Axis in the southernmost part of the front. In the Crimea, the open steppe suited well for close air support, and the Germans used it to break through the Soviet lines. The Red Army had previously conducted several offensives, and its forces were deployed forward, lacking the depth to contain the Axis breakthrough. The Soviets were unable to stop the Axis advance and had to abandon the peninsula. In Ukraine, the Soviets had finished their preparations first and went on the offensive, attempting to take Kharkov with a two-pronged attack. The Axis forces were not far behind in their deployment, and 5 days after the beginning of the Soviet attack, they went on an offensive of their own. The Red Army did not anticipate such a move, and the German units managed to cut off the attacking Soviet troops and destroy them. In the north, near Leningrad, the Soviets were unable to fully exploit their breakthrough. Having realized the vulnerability of their position, they decided to evacuate the salient. However, the Germans beat them to it and cut the neck of the salient. During the next month, the encircled Soviet forces were eliminated. In the center, both the Soviets and the Germans were preparing their own offensives. As the German operation was of smaller scale, it was ready first, and they proceeded to clear out the pocket south of the railroad. Soon, they had full control over the territory, although part of the Soviet forces managed to escape and reach their main lines. After having regrouped their forces, they turned against the northern salient. They cut its communications with the main Soviet front and pushed into it, eliminating most of the Soviet units. Destruction of the Red Army formations behind the German lines forced a change in the Soviet plans, and their offensive in the center was postponed. In the south, the failure of the Kharkov offensive had left the Red Army in disarray, and the Germans decided to exploit the opportunity. They conducted 2 smaller attacks, but this time the Soviets pulled their forces back and did not offer strong resistance. The amount of prisoners taken was limited. Now everything was ready to carry out the German plan to capture the Caucasus. As the first step, the Axis forces would encircle and destroy the Soviet formations on their southern flank. Then they would advance and take strong defensive positions along the Volga and Don rivers to cut the communications between the Soviet heartland and the Caucasus. This would shield the Axis forces in the south from the main force of the Red Army. As the third step, the Axis forces would move into the Caucasus and take over the oil fields. The first German attack reached the Don River as planned. The Soviets expected that they would turn north towards Moscow and deployed their reserves, conducting a counterattack from this direction. In the south, the Red Army began to withdraw to avoid encirclement. Because the German plan was founded on the assumption that the Soviets would avoid retreat, as they had done in the previous year, they were now confronted with the possibility of Soviet forces escaping the encirclement. They altered the plan, sending the forces immediately to the south in order to catch the Soviet units. However, the Soviet formations further south joined the retreat, allowing most of them to escape the encirclement. By this time, the Soviet command had understood the German intentions and had deployed their strategic reserves to keep the Axis away from the Volga River. Meanwhile, their other forces retreated south over the Don. During that time, the Germans had also captured Sevastopol, and when it was clear that the Caucasus direction was properly covered, they sent the freed up forces north to take Leningrad. In the central part of the front, the Germans were finishing the preparations to destroy another Soviet salient, but before that, the Red Army had finished deployment and commenced its offensive against the army group center. The Germans reinforced the defenses and then attempted to cut the southern Soviet salient with weaker forces, but were unable to. The terrain in the area of the Soviet attack was not suitable for the use of heavy weapons, and the main brunt of the fighting fell to the infantry, which suffered heavy casualties. Despite pushing the Germans back, they were unable to destroy their forces. Limited attacks continued for a month more, but they failed to secure more territory. In the north, the Germans planned to use reinforcements from the Crimea to cut off Leningrad. In addition, they planned to undertake several operations in order to improve their defensive positions. The Red Army was meanwhile preparing to re-establish the land connection to Leningrad by pushing through the thin strip of the German-held territory. The Soviets attacked first, and the Germans had to use the reserves to repel them. The defense tied up their forces, and they lost the time they needed for the encirclement of Leningrad. In addition, they could spare enough troops only to widen the neck of the Demyansk salient. In the south, the Axis had failed to destroy the Soviet formations opposing them, but in the same time the quick retreat had thrown the Soviet forces into disarray, putting them in need of reorganization. Meanwhile, the Axis troops were left unscathed. The Germans decided to solve the situation by not allowing the remaining Soviet units to reorganize and moved immediately towards the Caucasus, while the other part of their forces would secure the flank. The Soviet forces continued their retreat until they reached the Caucasus Mountains. There they made a stand and dug in on the bottlenecks. In the north, the Germans used the open steppe terrain to outmaneuver the Soviet reserves and moved slowly towards Volga. By the end of August, they had reached the river and entered the city of Stalingrad and began to slowly clear out the city. In the Caucasus, the German Alpine troops traversed the mountain passes, but they lacked the strength to reach the sea and were stopped on the southern slopes. During the following months, the spread out Axis forces continued to make small gains. Although the Axis had made serious advances, they were unable to deliver a crippling blow to the Soviet war effort and decided to complete their objectives in the next year. They anticipated that the Soviets would have enough strength for a winter offensive in one sector and that they would attempt to destroy the salient in the central part of the front. the Germans countered the threat by deploying their reserves. Meanwhile, in the south, the Axis forces attempted to improve their positions as much as possible before the onset of winter. They tried to cut off the Red Army units in the Black Sea coast, but they could not break through the hills. In the central Caucasus, the Germans caught the Red Army off balance and moved deep into the hills until the Soviets redeployed their units. After that, coming of the winter snow put an end to the offensives in the Caucasus. By the Volga, the Axis forces had advanced steadily during the last months, and in the middle of November they were in the process of removing the last Soviet presence in Stalingrad. They were not expecting a major attack in the south, and instead of creating a defense in depth, the forces of the Axis flank were deployed offensively, concentrating in the east at the point of effort. In this situation, the Soviet breachheads over the Don were considered of secondary importance and were covered by Romanian forces, who lacked anti-tank equipment and were not keen on fighting. Contrary to German estimations, the Red Army had the forces to conduct 2 winter offensives. They had deployed their second force in the south to make full use of the Axis deployment in this sector. The Red Army managed to achieve surprise and overran the Romanian forces opposing them. Then they broke into the undefended Axis rear, cutting off their forward units. Next, they had planned to reach the sea and cut off all the Axis forces in the Caucasus region. However, some of the Red Army forces had to be diverted to repel the German attempt to relieve the Stalingrad pocket, and the advance could not be conducted to full extent. The year in the south ended with the Soviets crushing all Axis hopes to sustain their forces in the Caucasus and Stalingrad, and were threatening to advance into Ukraine. At the same time, the Red Army was attempting to cut the German salient in the center. The Germans had deployed their reserves and were prepared for the attack. The Soviet attacks were met with staunch defense, and where they were able to penetrate the German defenses, they were thrown back by counterattacks. The Soviet offensive failed to achieve its objectives, and only in the western sector did the Red Army achieve some success. Thus, 1942 came to an end. The Soviets had secured the oil, and now the Wehrmacht lacked a proper plan to defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces were moving west with the hope to inflict a decisive defeat on the Axis. At the same time, the Germans attempted to save the situation and create a stalemate. Whether they are successful will be decided in the next year. There is another question. How could I In the last months of 1942, the German forces were encircled at Stalingrad. At first, the Germans hoped to reverse the situation by relieving the pocket and maintaining it by air supply. However, as 1943 began, the Germans were forced to abandon their plans to relieve the city and were pushed back from its approaches. Despite that, they ordered their troops in Stalingrad to hold out as long as possible in order to tie up Soviet units and buy time. The advance of the Red Army created the possibility of the German troops in the Caucasus to be cut off. They ordered a full withdrawal from the region while their forces in the north kept the path of retreat open. The main effort of the Red Army was, however, directed against the Hungarian and Italian units on the northern flank. Their lightly equipped forces were unable to hold the line and were forced into a harsh winter retreat. Most of them lost their combat capabilities or were destroyed, leaving a large gap in the Axis lines. The German units in the north had also to retreat, but they were able to keep their battle worthiness intact. At the same time, the Germans managed to pull back part of their forces from the Caucasus. The remaining troops formed a breachhead on the coast to retain the opportunity for a summer push towards the oil fields. During January, both sides had their full attention set on the southern sector. The lack of the German reserves allowed the Red Army to achieve 2 small but significant victories. They re-established a land connection to Leningrad, and in the central part of the front they captured the railway junction of Velikie Luki. For the Axis, the situation in the south continued to deteriorate. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, freeing up significant numbers of Soviet units. The Red Army forces moving west into the Ukraine were not very formidable, but the large gap in the Axis line left them little opposition. The Soviet command decided to exploit this opportunity and attempted to cut off almost all of the army group south. In response, the Germans used the forces retreating from the Caucasus to extend their front eastwards and pull their main force west. The Red Army moved further west to bypass their line and encircle them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from 2 sides and disorganized their forward detachments. Having caught the Soviet southern flank off balance, the Germans now wanted to push in both from north and south at the same time, destroying the whole Soviet force. They began to muster their units for the northern attack. In the south, their troops continued onwards, retaking Kharkov. But in the north they failed to concentrate a force sufficient for the attack, though they were able to stop the Red Army's advance. By this time, both the Soviets and the Germans had exhausted their forces and went on defensive. As the fighting in the south had drawn all German reinforcements, the Red Army prepared to launch a major offensive in the north and center. The Germans realized the danger and responded by abandoning their most vulnerable positions before the Soviets had finished deployment, and the attacks that took place failed to achieve their goals. Being confronted with a much stronger German line, the Red Army abandoned its offensive plans and the Eastern Front became quiet. With the end of the winter campaign, the Axis had lost the capabilities necessary to knock the Soviet Union out of the war by capturing the areas vital for its war effort. Now they planned to win through attrition by holding on to the occupied areas and inflicting vast casualties to the attacking Red Army. In this way they could drain the areas remaining under the Soviet control, dry up resources and create a stalemate. The Red Army, on the other hand, set out to take back the economically vital western lands of the Soviet Union, which would give it a strategic advantage. However, this time they would play it safe. Their previous offensives had been threatened by the German armored counterattacks, and this time they decided to receive them on prepared defenses. At the same time with building up the fortifications, the Red Army formed a massive offensive force. As part of their defense strategy, the Germans planned a number of limited offensives to encircle Soviet forces and shorten their defensive line. The most promising of these was the encirclement of the Soviet units in the Kursk salient. It took 3 months for the German build-up to match the gradually improved Soviet defenses, and in the beginning of July they launched their attack. The Germans made some headway, but were ultimately stopped dead in the depth of the Soviet defenses. Having for the time tied up the strongest German armored units, the Red Army now released its forces for the offensive. The attacks were to be carried out in consecutive stages along several sectors of the front. First, the Red Army struck into the rear of the German troops north of Kursk. Being unable to contain the attack and wishing to avoid the danger of encirclement, the Germans began the process of evacuating the salient. At the same time, the Red Army launched an attack in the south. The Germans redeployed their forces and contained it. By this time, the Soviet units south of Kursk had finished reorganization and pushed towards Kharkov. The Germans redeployed their forces to the sector but failed to hold the city, though succeeded in temporarily containing the Soviet advance. The situation in the north was more under the German control. The Red Army failed to break through the German defenses near Smolensk. At the same time, the Germans had finished their withdrawal to the new line, strengthening their positions further. By this time, the Germans had been able to maintain the balance and check the Red Army's attacks. However, the renewal of the Soviet offensive near the sea broke the German line and forced them into a large-scale retreat. Even more, the concurrent offensive against the lightly fortified German positions on the former western edge of the Kursk salient resulted in a breakthrough the Germans weren't able to contain. They now realized that they lacked the troops necessary to contain the Soviets in their present line and ordered a retreat to a much better defendable Panther-Wotan position that was centered around the Dnieper River and its tributaries. At the same time, the Soviet breakthrough near Smolensk hastened the retreat of Army Group Center. With the German forces taking a stronger defensive position, the Red Army had to concentrate its main effort on a shorter section of the front. They decided to make regaining western Ukraine the main priority. First, however, we'll take a look at the central part of the front, where the Red Army had outrun the Germans to the Dnieper and had established a breachhead on the junctions of the Army Group Center and South. They planned to trap the whole Army Group Center by combined strikes from the breachhead and from a breakthrough in the north, while the other forces would pin the Germans in place. In October, while part of the Red Army was still recovering from the pursuit, battles were fought in order to secure the breachhead. Meanwhile, the other forces began creating a breach in the northern part of the front. With their main focus being in the south, the Red Army had established several breachheads over the Dnieper in Ukraine. After they had got their heavy equipment over the river, they attempted local breakouts, first of which took place in the south. The Germans were able to contain it. Then the Soviets broke through the German land front, severing their connection with the Crimea. They proceeded with another breakout attempt near Kiev, but the Germans redeployed their troops and pushed it back towards the river. Having not fully succeeded in the breakouts, the Red Army adopted a more systematic approach, slowly but surely expanding its breachheads and massing troops for a larger breakout. In the center, the Red Army was now better prepared, which allowed it to increase the pressure. It resulted in a breakthrough in the north. The Germans held on to the flanks in the hopes of conducting a counterattack and cutting the Soviet forces off. Then the Soviets launched their main attack from the southern bridgehead. It broke through the lines and gained limited success, though it failed to achieve its objective. The Germans were able to prevent a deeper breakthrough by abandoning territory and pulling back their front line. As 1943 ended, the Red Army was ready for the winter offensive, which would encompass the whole Soviet-German front. In Ukraine, the Germans had concentrated their defenses in the Great Bend of the Dnieper. This allowed the Red Army to catch them off balance by mounting a breakout from the Kiev bridgehead. The Germans managed to contain their advance only with great difficulties. They wanted to keep their last position near the Dnieper River as a staging area for a possible counterattack and did not evacuate it despite the evident threat. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces, but without their heavy equipment. With the German attention directed towards the pocket, the Soviet forces launched attacks on the flanks, threatening to sever the connection between the army groups south and center. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were continuing with their attempt to encircle Army Group Center itself. In the north, the Germans realized they lacked the force to cut off the Red Army's breakthrough and abandoned the exposed salients. The Red Army now attempted to encircle the town of Vitebsk, but it was not met with success. Most of the Red Army's offensive assets were deployed in the south, and as a result, the goals of the Soviet forces in the center proved to be beyond the means to achieve them. The offensives took limited territory at the price of large casualties and were eventually abandoned. During the summer, the Soviet pressure on the Army Group North had not been as strong as against the other army groups, and the Germans had dispatched a lot of its strength to other fronts. Despite its greatly reduced strength, the army group had not withdrawn to the shorter line and still held its forward positions. The Red Army attempted to encircle part of the German forces during the winter offensive. The Germans evaded the encirclement and then attempted to resist on the new positions, but they lacked the strength to do so, and it was decided to withdraw to the Panther Line. Both armies settled on the new line, and during the remaining part of the winter, the Red Army undertook only some limited attacks in order to probe the German defenses. The Red Army was planning to achieve its main success in the south. During the preceding half-year, the Soviet forces were slowly but steadily consolidating their positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and by the beginning of March, this process was complete. The German Army Group South was by then pushed into the open plains and did not retreat behind any other natural obstacle, leaving it vulnerable. The Soviets wanted to pin the whole army group to the Carpathian Mountains or the Black Sea and destroy it. The Axis were unable to resist the Soviet tank armies, and the whole front fell back. Near the Black Sea, they began pulling back their forces, but in the west, the Red Army encircled several German corps. The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force back to their front lines. Then the Red Army captured the Crimea as the last operation of the winter campaign. The Soviet Union had taken back its most economic. Early summer 1944. The war had decisively turned against Germany. The Axis forces had been consistently pushed back, and both from east and west, the Allies were preparing to move into Germany. The Western Allies had gathered their forces to open the second front, and the Germans had prepared a large force to counter them. They intended to push the Western Allies into the sea and then concentrate again on the eastern front. There, the Red Army had achieved a strong superiority and was hoping to finish the war in a two-stage operation. First, the German forces on the eastern front would have to be destroyed on their advanced positions without them being able to retreat into Germany. After the Axis forces had been severely weakened, the Red Army would advance into Germany and take over its resources to wage war. As the first step, Finland would be knocked out of the war. Then, the Red Army would encircle and destroy the German Army Group Center. After that, the Soviet forces would advance towards the Vistula River and the Baltic, which would result in cutting off the Army Group North. The German forces would then be pushed into the sea and destroyed. Finally, an attack would be launched in the south in order to seize the Romanian oil fields. These operations would destroy most of the Axis military capabilities on the eastern front and clear the scene for an attack into Germany itself. Back in 1941, the Finns had seized forward defensive positions on the Soviet territory, and since then the northern part of the front hadn't seen much action. The Soviet plan entailed encircling the Finnish forces on their forward positions and then advancing into the depth of the country without much resistance. The first attack on the Karelian Isthmus pushed the Finnish forces back, but they were able to escape the encirclement and conducted an orderly retreat. The Soviets launched an offensive in the east, but here too the Finns were able to pull their forces back and deploy them on a new defensive line. By this time, the focus of the Red Army had changed to the central part of the front, and they couldn't spare forces for follow-up operations in Finland. Thus, armistice was signed in September, and Finland was able to leave the war with fewer concessions than could have been possible. With Finland leaving the war, the German presence in the north of the country became untenable. Using the rough terrain to their advantage, they conducted a stage-by-stage retreat and were able to evade the Finnish and Soviet pursuit, extracting their units into Norway. The Red Army didn't follow them, and the large-scale fighting in the north came to an end. As the battles were raging in Finland, the Soviet forces were about to launch their attack in the center. Army Group Center could be attacked from the south and north of the Pripyat marshes, and Soviets had created two large concentrations of forces. The southern attack would be more dangerous for the Germans, and they directed all of their attention to that sector, thinking that the northern one was a ruse. This allowed the Soviets to achieve a total surprise. They attacked the flanks of the Army Group Center. The German forces were forbidden to retreat, and many of their units were encircled near the original front. Their southern forces were able to pull back further, but were also eventually trapped. The Red Army advanced towards Minsk with little opposition. The Germans were unable to pull their remaining forces back in time, and they were encircled east of Minsk. With half of the Army Group Center's strength being destroyed, the Red Army's advance continued. One opportunity to stop the Soviet advance was to pull back part of the Army Group North and counterattack at the flank of the advancing Soviet forces. Due to strategic considerations, Army Group North stayed in its position. Instead, it was decided to stop the Soviet advance by redeploying units from other sectors of the front. With their main focus in the west, there were no ready reserves in the east. It would take time before the Germans could gather a large enough force for other sectors of the eastern front. When the front had moved far enough west, the Soviet forces in the south joined the action. They had built up an especially strong concentration here, and the Germans were unable to stop it. After achieving a breakthrough, their force was divided into two. One of them was tasked with securing the beachhead over the Vistula River for a future offensive, and the other moved north in a flanking move against the Army Group Center. The Germans had finally gathered a reserve force of armored units and could start patching up the front. There were two critical situations: the breakthrough on the southern flank of the Army Group Center and the large gap between Army Group Center and North. The Germans decided to first deal with the southern situation. As the Soviet forces neared Warsaw, Polish resistance launched an uprising in the city. However, the German armored forces arrived, blunted the Soviet spearhead, and the front was stabilized. Meanwhile, the Red Army had begun the destruction of the Army Group North. It exploited the gap between the Army Groups North and Center, and soon the Soviet forces established a narrow corridor to the sea, severing the land communications of the Army Group North. However, the Red Army didn't have the strength to push the Germans into the sea, and the Germans were able to trade land for time. This gave them time to redeploy their armored reserves to the sector, and they counterattacked, re-establishing the land connection with the Army Group North. The Red Army now made a pause to gather sufficient strength for the final push. However, when their advance continued, the Germans were able to pull out of the salient. The Red Army wasn't able to catch and destroy their units. It now switched its focus to the south and launched an attack towards the sea, catching the Germans off balance. Soon the Red Army reached the sea, cutting Army Group North off in Courland, but they were unable to finish the German forces off. The Soviet forces now extended their attack further south, but the Germans had had the time to re-establish a solid front, and the offensive bogged down. October marked the end of the Red Army's summer campaign in the north and center. The Soviet forces now began a long preparation for the second phase of their plan, the invasion of Germany. During the Soviet offensive in the center, heavy fighting was taking place on the western front. The Germans had deployed their forces along the French coast in anticipation of the Allied landings. With their forces spread out, their immediate coastal defenses in Normandy were unable to deny the Allies a beachhead. The Germans combined their troops for an effort to push the Allies into the sea. However, they ended up only having the strength to contain them. For most of June and July, both the Allies and the Germans deployed more and more forces to Normandy, but as the Germans had also to deal with the crisis on the Eastern Front, they were unable to allocate enough troops, and in August the Allies broke out of the beachhead. Part of the German forces were destroyed, and others had to conduct a quick withdrawal. With their troops disorganized, the Germans were unable to take advantage of the defensive river positions in northern France and could check the Allied advance only in the hilly terrain in front of the German border. The Allies began preparations to carry their advance into Germany itself. As the Allied forces were breaking out of Normandy, the Soviets were about to begin the final part of the plan, an attack against the Army Group South. During the summer, more and more forces were diverted from the Army Group South in order to deal with the crisis in the center. Despite that, the Army Group had retained its forward deployment in front of the river lines. In late August, the Red Army launched its offensive on the southern part of the front. It took advantage of the vulnerable deployment of the Axis forces and managed to encircle part of them. Romania had long sought an opportunity to withdraw from the conflict. And now, when a large part of the German forces was neutralized, they made peace with the Allies and soon declared war on Germany. The Red Army now moved south unopposed. The surviving German units attempted to re-establish the front in the Carpathian Mountains. However, the Red Army moved west along the plains to outflank them. As the Soviet units entered Bulgaria, this country too joined the war against Germany and began mobilizing its army. In the Carpathians, the Germans were now joined by the Hungarian army and attempted to re-establish a solid front along the mountain range. However, they didn't have enough time, and with the help of the Romanian units north of the mountains, the Red Army was able to cross the passes into the Hungarian plain with little opposition. Now the Axis presence in the mountains became a liability, and the Red Army attempted to cut off these forces with a two-pronged attack. The northern attack was unable to push through the mountains, and this allowed the Axis forces to concentrate on the southern Soviet spearhead and destroy it. This slowed the Red Army's advance enough for the Axis forces to withdraw their units from the salient in time. The defection of Bulgaria and the Soviet advance into Hungary threatened to cut off the German occupation force in Greece. This area wasn't considered important by the Red Army, and they decided to commit their limited resources to Hungary. This gave the Germans time to gather their units from the islands to the mainland, and soon they began their withdrawal from Greece. They were able to extract much of their units intact. Until the end of the war, the southernmost part of the Eastern Front was of secondary importance for the Red Army, and fighting there would be relegated to local formations. By October, the first phase of the Soviet plan was complete. They were able to deny the Axis the Romanian oil supplies, deal heavy damage to Army Group Center and South, and while they were unable to destroy the Army Group North, it was trapped in Courland. Germany itself was now vulnerable to an invasion. The forces in the north would undertake large-scale preparations, while the units in Hungary were to continue their advance. The Soviet forces continued their push, but by that time the Axis had recovered from their prior disasters, and the Red Army's advance was checked between the Carpathians and the Danube. With the central front quieting down, the Germans began deploying more forces to Hungary. The Soviets were able to extend their southern flank further west over the Danube, but the progress in the north was far slower. Facing difficulties, the Red Army concentrated on a smaller objective, taking Budapest, where the Axis had deployed a large garrison. During December, the Soviet forces slowly moved to encircle the city, and after its communications with the main Axis front had been cut, began a costly operation to clear the city of the defenders. With the northern part of the front still quiet, the Germans had brought up reinforcements and attempted to re-establish the land connection with the Budapest garrison. In the following month, they achieved some progress, but were eventually unable to reach the city. In the last months of 1944, most of Soviet forces were preparing for an offensive into Germany, and the fronts were relatively quiet. The Germans misinterpreted this as a sign that the Red Army had exhausted itself. They sent freed-up forces west in their last hope to inflict a decisive defeat on the Western Allies by encircling their forces in Belgium. However, the attack was fought to a standstill in the Battle of the Bulge, and the Western Allies began to push the Germans back. With their reserves used up, there was little that could be spared for the eventual battle for Germany, which now began on the Eastern Front. During the pause in the fighting, the Germans had an opportunity to evacuate their forces from Courland, but they decided to keep them there. So, after the Western Allies had been defeated, they would be able to use the Courland position to conduct an encirclement. Now there wasn't much opportunity left to evacuate them. By mid-January, the Soviets were making final preparations for their massive attack in Poland. They had created 3 large concentrations of forces. The central force would advance directly towards Berlin, while the others would secure the flanks. At the same time, the German forces in the East Prussia would be encircled and destroyed. The setup of the German troops in Poland was unfavorable, with their reserves expended and a lot of their forces deployed away from the main direction of the Soviet attack. The offensive began in mid-January. The weak German defense in the south and center was pushed aside and the Soviet troops advanced quickly. But the northern attack got bogged down in Prussia and was unable to advance. As a result, the central force outran the northern and its flank was becoming increasingly overextended. The Germans threw all of their forces east to halt the Soviet attack. After the Soviet forces had reached the Oder River in front of Berlin, they had to make a decision. Whether to keep moving towards the capital of the Reich immediately and risk encirclement from the flanks, or to secure the flanks first and then continue the offensive from a better position. They decided for the latter option. With the Germans scrambling their forces and the Soviet logistics extended, the operations proceeded in a slower pace. In February, the Soviets expanded their flanks to the sea in the north and to the mountains in the south and pushed the German forces in Prussia into small pockets near the sea. This delay allowed the Germans to re-establish a solid front line before Berlin, and the Soviets would need more time to continue their advance west. Meanwhile, the Red Army had cleared Budapest and had made preparations to resume the offensive. By this time, the Germans had switched their focus back on the eastern front to defend the Reich. They had deployed a large force in front of Berlin, but Hungary was the last area where they could hope to conduct offensive warfare and had sent their last panzer forces there to conduct an encirclement. The Red Army had learned of their plan and had decided to let the Germans attack first before starting its own offensive. The Germans were too weak by this time to conduct even limited offensives, and soon their attack was absorbed by the Soviet defenses. The Red Army then attacked and pushed the Axis forces back, making them abandon all captured territory. The Axis resistance was soon greatly reduced and the Soviet forces moved into Austria. After they had captured Vienna and secured their occupation zone in eastern Austria, the advance was stopped. With a large part of the German forces scrambled to the east, they lacked the troops to properly hold the Rhine river line. In mid-March, the Western Allies crossed the river in several places and moved into the German rear. They pinned most of their immobilized forces in place and then proceeded with an encirclement of the German troops in the Ruhr area. Having neutralized a large part of the German forces, the Allies spread out and moved through North Germany almost unopposed. By mid-April, their forces had reached the Elbe River, a line dividing the areas of responsibility of the Red Army and the Western Allies. At the same time, the Red Army destroyed most of the German forces left on the Prussian coast and deployed the freed-up units to the Berlin direction. In the middle of April, the offensive was launched. The Red Army wanted to avoid costly urban combat in the city and moved directly towards Berlin, encircling the capital. Most of the German forces were left outside the city. Hitler then ordered them to move into Berlin, but they were too weak and were only able to fight their way out west. Thus, the Red Army was able to clear Berlin only in about 10 days. Soon the Soviet forces made contact with the Western Allies. By that time, Germany had lost most of its territory, and with the loss of the capital, the last Axis forces on the Eastern Front were to surrender soon. In the last operation of the Soviet-German War, the Soviet forces cut off the path west of the German forces in Czechoslovakia and secured their surrender to the Red Army. During this time, the general German surrender was declared, and soon after that, the last remaining pockets of Axis resistance in Europe were liquidated. With that, World War II in Europe ended, and so do the areas on the Eastern Front.